Welcome to the Full Nelson. Today I'm going to address the question of what is the best caliber for a semi-automatic handgun. There's a lot of information about this. I'm sure you guys have your own thoughts and ideas and opinions, but there's really only one right answer to this question, and that is the .45. The .45 has been scientifically proven to not only kill a man, but to also destroy his soul. Chuck Norris uses a .45. Now that we've got some of those jokes out of the way, the only true answer to the question of what is the best caliber is that there isn't one. Every caliber makes a compromise. The .45 has more power compared to a 9mm, but it sacrifices capacity. The 9mm has higher capacity, but it doesn't have as much power. The .40 Smith & Wesson, the .357 SIG, the 10mm, every caliber makes a compromise. Today I want to give you guys some information that will hopefully help you select the caliber that would be most suitable for your intended application. I feel that the 9mm, .357 SIG, .40 Smith & Wesson, .45, and 10mm are all more than adequate against a human target. If you look at the ballistics gel test, they all have plenty of penetration, and if you use decent hollow points, they will all be more than adequate to eliminate a human threat. If you place your shots in a vital area, the heart, the lungs, the neck, the head, any of those types of areas, I don't think it will make any difference at all whether it was a .45 or a 9mm. With that being said, I do think there are some situations in which some of these calibers are preferable to others. And the main area in which I think that's the case is if you plan on using your handgun or your firearm in self-defense against an animal. So let me give you an example. If you had to use your firearm in self-defense against a brown bear, would you rather have a 9mm or a 10mm? Would you rather have something like this, that the maximum bullet is about 147 grains, or something like this where you can shoot 220, 230 grain bullets? Would you rather have something like this or a .45? I personally would rather have a .45 or a 10mm. And I feel that in those types of situations, a 10mm, .45, some of the other calibers definitely have some advantages over a 9mm. So if you want to use your firearm or your handgun, you want to get just one full-size handgun, and you're going to use it as your woods gun, your backup hunting gun. You're going to use it when you're hiking in areas where there could be big predators or big animals. And you also want to use it against, as in a self-defense situation against humans. I wouldn't recommend a 9mm. I would go with a 10mm, a .45, .40 Smith & Wesson, something like that that offers a more powerful round. Now, if you just want to use it in a self-defense situation against humans only, take your pick. Any one of the calibers will be more than adequate. I have owned quite a few of the different calibers. 9mm, 10mm, and .40 Smith & Wesson are the ones that I've owned so far. I don't have a lot of experience with a .45 or with a .357 SIG. I don't think they're bad calibers. I think they, against human target, would be just as good as any of the rest of those calibers. But I'm going to kind of walk you guys through the experiences that I've had with those calibers that I mentioned. So the first handgun I ever bought was a Glock 20 SF chambered in 10mm. And the reason why I bought that gun was because my intended use was to have a firearm that would be capable in a self-defense situation against bears. So I bought that 10mm. My wife and I live close to Yellowstone National Park, and we go hiking in that area fairly frequently. And that was a much more suitable caliber, or is much more suitable, than any of the other calibers that I looked at. So that's why I bought the 10mm. I really like the 10mm. Some people think it recoil's too substantial. For some people, maybe, smaller people or women or something like that maybe, but I think anybody can get to where they can master that gun pretty easy. The recoil was manageable in my experience. For those of you who don't know anything about a 10mm, but you know something about revolvers, you can load a 10mm to where it's essentially on par with a .357 Magnum. The difference is you don't get really heavy bullets out of a .357 Magnum. You generally don't get up into 220, 230 grains with the 357 Magnum. But for the bullets that are the same weight, the 10 millimeter is pushing the bullets at roughly the same velocity as what a 357 Magnum is capable of. So it's like having 15 rounds of 357 Magnum. I chose it because I shoot a semi-automatic better than I do a revolver. And in Yellowstone, the bears aren't typically the same size that they are in a place like Russia or Alaska or some of those places where big brown bears will get up to 1,000, 1,500 pounds in that range. The bears in the lower 48 just aren't as big, so I figured a 10 millimeter would be adequate. So that's why I chose a 10 millimeter. And if you need a gun and you want a semi-automatic, I think a 10 millimeter is a great choice for a self-defense caliber for bears or large animals. Now, with that said, that's the first semi-automatic handgun I owned. After that, I ended up buying a Glock 17, a Glock 22, a Glock 23, and a Glock 27. 3 of those are chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson. One of them is 9 millimeter. And I liked the idea of the compromise of 40 makes. If I were out fishing or something like that, and I were in an area where there's not bears, but there's moose or something, an animal that size, I like the idea of a 40 more than I do a 9 millimeter. And I like the compromise that a 40 made between those two, so that's why I went with a 40. The other thing that I liked about the 40 is that I could get these conversion barrels, and this is pretty neat. If you go with a 45, a 40 Smith & Wesson, a 10 millimeter, anything bigger than a 9, you can buy a 40 to 9 conversion barrel and still shoot 9 millimeter in any of those other guns. And a barrel like this will cost you $80 to $100. So I like that too about the 40. It gave me the ability to shoot both calibers. With that said, I eventually got away from the 40 Smith & Wesson. I sold all 3 of those, and now I only have these 2 9 millimeters you see on the table, and I will add some other 9 millimeters to my collection in the future. And the reason why I use 9 millimeter almost exclusively as my self-defense caliber against human targets really has nothing to do with its capability against a human target. It was a combination of reasons, but the biggest reason was because I reload my own ammunition. And when I would go to reload the 40 Smith & Wesson and the 10 millimeter, when I would load them hot, the brass casing will bulge really bad towards the base. And then when you resize it, you get this crease in the bottom of the brass casing. And what happens is if you keep reloading that, stretching that area, you get a really bad weakness in that point, and that will rupture and blow your gun up. Most of the people you've heard about who have had 40 caliber Glocks blow up and stuff like that, that's the reason why, in my opinion, is because you get reloaders who, like me, load quite a bit, and then you end up loading these a bunch of times instead of chucking the brass, and it blows your gun up. This issue I've never had with the 9 millimeter. So for me, I think all of the calibers are great, perfectly suitable against a human target. I think some are better than others against a large predator or an animal. I've discussed that already. But for me, it really came down to this, reloading. I ran into a lot of problems with the 40 and the 10 millimeter with the brass. And I just hated having to chuck my brass after reloading it 2 or 3 times. So I noticed that as I loaded my 9 millimeter, I never had that. This particular round 9 millimeter, I don't know how many times it's been loaded, a lot. I bet that's been reloaded 6 or 7 times at least, and I'll probably load it another 6 or 7 times. And I don't dumb down any of my loads when I load, which I could have done. That would have helped with the brass stretching. But to me, there's no point in having a 10 millimeter if I'm going to load really wimpy loads in it. But even with loading my 9 millimeter a lot, I don't have those problems with my brass getting stretched out and then I resize it and it's bulging and getting those types of weaknesses. So that's the biggest reason why I use 9 millimeter for the most part. I just wanted to give you guys some insight into what I've experienced and why I've chosen the calibers I've chosen. There are other advantages with the 9 millimeter, lower recoil, these cool 33 round magazines you can get with Glocks. The ammunition's cheaper, and the reloading issues I've discussed, stuff like that. Those things are all great, but those aren't the reason why I chose the 9 millimeter. I mean, like I said, I owned almost all 40s. And as far as the performance of the round and the power and having a round that kind of does everything pretty well if you had to use it against an animal or person, I think the 40 and the 10 millimeter and 45, some of those rounds would be more suitable for the, if that's what you want out of the firearm. But these firearms are only, their only purpose is against a human target, and then, you know, target shooting and stuff like that. And they're advantageous when it comes to the reloading aspect, so that's why I went with the 9. So that's been my experience. Don't let anybody convince you that this caliber is the be-all, end-all caliber. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. You guys have to decide exactly what you want and what your intended use is. One of the things I do like better about the 10 millimeter than the 45 is that the 10 millimeter is a more powerful round, ballistically speaking, but you don't lose as much capacity with a 10 millimeter as you do a 45. With the 10 millimeter, you can hold 15 plus 1 in the chamber, the same as the 40 Smith & Wesson, and yet you have a more powerful round than a 45. With the 45, you get 13 plus 1 in a full-size Glock. So that's one of the advantages of a 10 millimeter. The disadvantage is you can't get a 10 millimeter in a Springfield XDS, I don't think. You can't get one in an M&P, or a Smith & Wesson M&P. I don't think you can get one in... The only other gun I think I know of besides a Glock that's chambered in 10 millimeter is a Colt Delta Elite. So it's a platform that's not readily supported. Ammunition is way more expensive than a 45, so it definitely has its drawbacks. Like I said, everything has its strengths and weaknesses. So you guys have to decide for yourselves what you want. That's all I've got for you guys today. If you have any questions or comments about any of this, and you want to know any of my experiences with any of these particular guns I've owned, or reloading, or any of these calibers, feel free to leave any of those questions in the comment section. Thanks for watching. That's all I've got for you guys today. Have a nice day.